ICU.
As the nation continues to mourn those killed in a violent elementary school shooting, teachers in classrooms across Texas are saying, enough is enough. Reports of a teacher shortage continue to dominate local and regional headlines.
Bottom line is, if people aren't in the right mental state, they can't learn at the levels they need to. They can't teach at the levels they need to. We're not taking into consideration taking care of the personal needs of students, teachers, and of families.
An unguarded chat about the future of public education. What steps need to be taken to grapple with a teacher shortage throughout the region? We'll talk solutions with University of Houston professor Dr. Duncan Klusman, who's worked in public education for nearly 35 years. Oh yeah, I feel you. We hear you. I see you. It's ICU. I'm Eddie Robinson. Dr. Duncan Klusman is a clinical assistant professor at the University of Houston. He dedicated some 18 years of serving 35,000 students of the Spring Branch Independent School District community out in the west side of Harris County, with the last of those 11 years as superintendent of schools. He's been working in public education since 1988. So he's very passionate about the teaching profession and its future. Here to provide us with his perspective on the shortage of our educators here in Texas, it's Dr. Duncan Klusman. Duncan, thanks so much for stopping by our ICU studios in person and being a guest to talk about this very important matter.
Thank you very much, Eddie. It's great to be here.
Now, I wanted to start off our conversation by mentioning to you that I had an opportunity a few months ago having a conversation offline, off the record, with Dr. Ruth Simmons. She's the president of Prairie View A&M University.
Wonderful person.
Yes, and this was like maybe 3 weeks or so prior to her making the announcement that she would be retiring. So she was like ready to talk, and I was very excited in meeting and talking with her because it felt like I was getting some advice from my grandmother who's passed away, but it just felt like that's how she was coming at me. And I mentioned to her in our discussion, and I told her, I said straight up, I do not want to be a teacher. I do not want to be in a classroom. And she laughed. I laughed. We had an amazing sort of conversation about that. Heaven knows, God's will, whatever you want to, how you want to look at it, 10, 15, 20 years, I might find myself inside a classroom. But I do want to ask you this because it's sort of like hitting the reason why I do not want to be in a classroom. What has happened to our students? What is happening with our youth, particularly junior high and high school students? Do they care? Or does it matter what demographic or racial group you're referring to? Because some students may actually be doing wonderful and they're doing fine. And I shouldn't generalize them or lump everyone into this one group. But what's happening with our students?
Well, I find our students are very engaged and want to be motivated. I don't think they're always in a system that motivates them very well. But I will just tell you, in my 28 years in public ed, the best days were the days where I was around students. And so my experience with middle school and high school students, and most of my experience was with middle school and high school. So middle school
you were principal,
assistant principal, a middle school principal, high school assistant principal, high school teacher, was around that age group.
Okay.
And I find them very intriguing, very motivating. But I think there's so many challenges in our society, and I think those challenges are so much greater coming out of the pandemic. This has been such a disruptive time, the most disruptive in my lifetime as far as a long period of time. In fact, I was with a community group one day, and they were talking about it, and a teacher was describing how, my ninth graders are acting like sixth graders. And someone in the audience made the point, well, the last time they were in school in a normal school year was in sixth grade.
Wow.
Like they haven't had this time
That's
to
a good
really develop as seventh graders, eighth graders, and then as ninth graders. Part of the reason why I was in education all those years is probably see them differently than the general public.
Okay.
And I think students are hungry for a system that really lets them be authentic and individualize and really find their passion. I don't know if that's the system they're always in today.
And you know what? I mean, I've seen a lot of TikTok videos. You know, that's where students are nowadays with social media, and students are playing pranks on teachers and they're calling them by their first name. And it's a prank, of course, but I find that to be really alarming, even though it is a prank. But when it gets on TikTok, it becomes a trend. And, you know, you should see the facial expressions on these teachers' faces. And it reminds me of, on some level, their wiring and saying, these students really don't respect me. And it almost feels like the state of Texas and the administration in and of itself, they're feeling the same way. Are they being heard?
Well, I think we use today kind of these examples we see one off, right? The TikToks, the Facebook, different things that are kind of, and they may not be one instance, there may be a few instances, but that's not the experience you have every day in the classroom. And I think what I have found is, you know, teachers who command that respect for students get that respect, right? If you walk in that classroom and you move right into teaching and you have a system that works in the classroom, you kind of command that respect.
Sure.
And you see that. But definitely, I think in our society in general, we're seeing just a lack of respect, right? I think that whatever happens in society and in communities ends up happening in school buildings. And so, you know, we work very hard in school buildings to try to set an expectation for everyone. Mm-hmm. But also they represent our communities and they represent society, and we can't separate that, right? So you're going to see some things that happen in schools today that didn't happen when I was in the classroom. But I think great educators are able to adjust to that and move through that and make it work in the classroom.
You know, HISD recently announced that for the upcoming school year, the new starting salary for new HISD teachers is now at $61,500. That's an 11% pay increase, because previously HISD had announced its 5-year compensation plan on a 6.75% raise for teachers. About 2 weeks ago, Houston Teachers United sent out a tweet that said 1 in 12 teachers in Houston ISD have said that they won't be returning to the classroom next year. But according to a statement earlier this month, HISD officials say they're encouraged by the number of new applicants they've seen, adding that more than 93% of teachers say they're coming back this fall. So, Duncan, who's right? Who's wrong? Will the teacher shortage get worse before it gets any better?
Yeah, well, I think they're both right in some ways, to be honest with you. Okay. So just when we're losing the number of teachers we're losing, I do think what we're going to see is for the last 2 years, we're going to lose a substantial number of teachers compared to the past, just in general across public education. You know, when I was in the superintendent role, I know in the state of Texas, data showed that about a third of teachers were at retirement age. So they could leave any year they wanted to and lock in their retirement. And then when you see the conditions that have been created over the last 2 years, and teachers I talk to all the time are just saying, I'm making the decision to leave. Now I'm not going to stay in. I'm going to go ahead and retire, or I'm going to go look at a different profession. I'm hearing that much more than I ever heard. So even though I don't know exactly how to judge 800, I think we're definitely seeing a trend. And that 800 can actually get larger because teachers don't have to let systems know until probably around the 1st of July if they're leaving or not. So that number is probably going to grow substantially between now and July 1. So I think we're definitely seeing an exodus unlike we have seen in the last 20, 30 years. And then on the other end, we don't see the same level of students showing interest in formalized programs, preparing to be teachers. So you do have this combination, and we have seen over the last decade or two substantial growth in the number of students in Texas because of migration into the state from across the country. So you see hundreds of thousands of students being added each year. You need more teachers for that. So you do have, you had probably a situation occurring that was starting to get more dire over time, where you have less people being developed to be teachers. You have more teachers ready to retire and being able to retire. And then the pandemic hits. And you have the conditions that are created by the pandemic and all the residual issues around that. And I think you are going to see, I think when we look back at the data for this year, you're going to see a much larger number. So I would say, in a way, both are kind of correct, right? It may not be right now out of the norm for a system as large as HISD, but I think you are going to see an exodus. And often that exodus is individuals who have great experience of teaching and have this knowledge of years. That's what it concerns me too, is you're taking someone who has many years experience, knows exactly how to work with students, knows exactly how to teach, and you're bringing in someone who is going to have to learn that over time. That has to be a concern too.
You're listening to ICU. I'm Eddie Robinson, and we're speaking with Dr. Duncan Klusman. He's been a professor at the University of Houston for 4 years, but he's worked in public education since 1988, which included work as a superintendent of schools at Spring Branch ISD in West Harris County. Do you believe that teachers are being paid their worth? Should teachers in Texas be making more money?
I think teachers in Texas should clearly be making more money, but I think the conversation often is that beginning teacher salaries, which I think is the wrong conversation. So what you see systems do is, you're seeing in the paper every day across the state, right? This district's improving pay raises. New teacher salary, $60,000.
Okay.
The issue I find in teaching is it's not necessarily the beginning pay, but it's that the pay goes nowhere over 20 or 30 years.
It's that career advancement.
And so when we see systems constantly focus on just beginning teacher pay, I think it's missing where our issues are. I think what we need is a system that's stratified over the years and rewards teachers for staying in the profession and for progressing and for building their skill set. And that's what we're not seeing. So often what you hear in school systems is they talk about a midpoint salary increase, which means when they say, we're going to give a 5-6%, right now you're hearing large percentages, right, compared to the past, usually 2 or 3%.
Yeah.
That's at the average teacher salary. So that means if you've been in the classroom the longest and your salary is higher than everyone, you may not get the 5-6%. You may only get 2%. The new teacher may get 7%. And so I think one thing we tried to do in Spring Branch over those years is when we said 3%, 3% meant 3%, that it meant in all levels. So, typically what I wanted to look at each year as a superintendent is not only how are we in beginning teacher pay, but how are we at 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20, 25, 30, 40. And what I wanted to look at is how do we compare in the region at all of those levels? But what you find in public education is this focus on the midpoint that I think then does not reward the teachers who need to be rewarded the most, who have stayed in the profession all those years and who have a skill set unlike anyone else. And so I think the issue is, to me, is yes, we have a salary issue. It's not a beginning teacher salary. I believe leaving with a bachelor's degree and starting out at $60,000 is a very good starting salary. That's not where we need to continue to put our emphasis. Where we need to put our emphasis is those folks, where we know people leave, right? 5 to 7 years is a critical time period. Why aren't we paying attention to the 5-year mark? Why aren't we paying attention to the 20-year mark, the 25-year mark, the 30-year mark? And that's where I think if we can put more dollars in salaries, that's where we need to put it.
And it seems as if for the past 10 years, there's been sort of no movement, as it relates to the district with HISD. HISD says it plans to raise teacher salaries by 7%. Federation of Teachers say that's not enough. It should be 10%. As a matter of fact, according to HFT, a lot of teachers don't even live in HISD, and they've decided to work closer to their home base and make more money. According to the Houston Chronicle, it says here, of the 38 Houston area school districts, Crosby ISD paid the highest average teacher salary in 2020-2021 data. Average teacher pay of the Northeast District was $68,000 that school year. Spring Branch ISD came in second with an average pay of $68,000. Third was Deer Park ISD, and then fourth was Goose Creek. I'm curious to get your understanding of the state as a whole, when we speak of rankings and teacher salaries, the Data House Scholaroo sent ICU an email that ranks this year's best and worst states for teachers. And Dr. Klusman, it's pretty alarming. There are 50 states here in America. Where do you think Texas falls?
I would say it's in the bottom quartile for sure.
Well, 43. And what disturbed me the most about the United States of America map that Scholaroo sent us is that with there being 50 states, the numbers from 39 to 49, all of the states that are at the bottom tier are in the South. What does that tell you?
Well, it tells me a couple of things. First of all, when you look at Texas, we get skewed in the Houston market because we're probably one of the most competitive markets in the state around salaries for educators. So we get kind of skewed. And I'll give you a good example. My first year of teaching was where I graduated high school at Huntsville, Texas. And I made $17,200 to teach that year and to coach that year. The next year, my wife and I were engaged, getting married. She had a great job in Houston. And so I moved to Humble ISD. And I had a $5,000 pay increase and actually taught one less class when I came to Humble ISD. So in being the metropolitan area, we get kind of a skewed view because out in the rural areas and the smaller areas, it's much harder to even get near the salaries where we are today. Now, Texas, compared to other southern states, actually probably performs much better. I know talking to a friend in Mississippi who had retired, and she retired with a salary. At the time, she was telling me the story about 15 years ago. She retired with a salary that almost was the same as our beginning teachers at the time. Now, salaries do trend at times to cost of living. And in the past, I think Houston's changing, by the way. But, when I started my career in the Houston area in the 90s, cost of living was such that a salary here could be different than a salary in the northeast of the country because of the cost of living, or in the West Coast because of the cost of living. But clearly what we have not done across the whole state as a whole is keep up with the salaries where they need to. And again, I think that's driven by what you see at the out years. Like when we don't give the same increases to our most tenured teachers, to our teachers who have the most experience, it's going to drive that average down, because what you were quoting was averages, right?
Right.
And so you can have this skewed view at the beginning of the cycle, right, at the beginning of the schedule, but the average is driven by the whole schedule, by the whole cycle that's there. And I think we have not kept up with, and we have not looked at salary schedules correctly, and looked at folks who have been in the profession for 15, 20, 25, 30, 35 years. Because if we adjusted that significantly, I mean, my belief is, in today's terms, anyone who has been in this profession for 25 plus years should be making a six-figure salary.
That's right.
And if we took care of things like that, right? Then that average would definitely change.
And there are states outside of the South that I think they're seeing that, because Washington State is the top state, and then followed by New York. Scholaroo also noted that Texas teachers are making less money than they were 10 years ago. Scholaroo says it's declined nearly 2%, ranking them number 19 in salary growth nationally. Why has there not been a focus to keep up with inflation with teacher salary?
That's a really good point. I think we hit some very difficult budget times in the state around 2008, 2009, 2010. And I think you saw a shifting occur at that time where people stopped giving the annual increases, and they would give kind of what we would call one-time bumps, right? They wouldn't be locked into the schedule, but they would like, we're going to give you this $2,000, but we're not going to put it in your schedule. And so I think that's greatly affected it. The other thing is, we took away the power for the local school board to actually decide their tax rate. And we did that in the last decade. And so the local boards really don't have the ability to raise the funds they need to if they want to really address teacher salaries. And so the finances in public schools in Texas are completely controlled at the state level. And as a result of that, you're dependent on whatever happens every 2 years at the state level as far as what you're able to do in that realm. And so you don't, as a local elected board, you don't really have the ability to go in and do the things you need to address your dynamic. So if HISD really wanted to say, you know what, you're right, we think it needs to be 10%, they don't necessarily have the ability to adjust their tax rate to bring in the revenue to do that. The state has taken away the ability for local control and local decision-making by the local elected officials. And it's really controlled at the state level today. And so as a result, what you see is, particularly when politicians in Austin feel like, hey, we need the teacher vote, right? We need teachers to see us favorably. It's really interesting. I think in the 2000, see if I get this right, around 18, all of a sudden, lawmakers woke up after that election and said, ooh, they saw that where teachers voted and how teachers voted. And they all of a sudden said, oh, we need to pay attention to teachers. And they all of a sudden started to talk about large teacher raises. But what you can't do is figure out these one-off situations every 2 years and have any type of long-term effect on teacher salaries. We need a long-term, comprehensive view. And if local boards had control of decisions locally, they could drive those types of decisions.
Coming up, we continue our conversation with Dr. Duncan Klusman and ask about an alarming trend that seems to take place in education today. School administrators moving away from trusting teachers and allowing them to make the best decisions for their own students. How much responsibility should the state have on public education? And then later in this episode, we'll connect with one of our own staff members at Houston Public Media who used to be a school teacher. Find out what lessons she's learned and why she decided to leave the classroom. A provocative upcoming segment you won't want to miss. I'm Eddie Robinson. I see you. We'll be right back. If you're enjoying this program, please be sure to subscribe to our podcast, I See You with Eddie Robinson. You can hear all the past episodes and be notified when new episodes are released. Also, please take a minute to give us a review or comment. We love getting feedback from our listeners.
Today's episode deals with challenges in the education system. This episode was recorded before this week's tragic events in Uvalde, Texas.
You're listening to I See You. I'm Eddie Robinson, and we're speaking with Dr. Duncan Klusman. He's been a professor over at the University of Houston for 4 years, and he's done some really amazing work for more than a decade as a superintendent of schools at Spring Branch ISD in West Harris County. He's here in studio. We're so grateful for that to help us unpack the latest news of there being a teacher shortage here in the state of Texas. How much of the state government are their fingerprints on all of this? You know, I remember back in 2015 where people had been asking you, would you consider being state commissioner, of the Texas system and in education? You didn't want to answer, or at least, you were like, if the governor reaches out to me, we'll have those conversations. But how much of a responsibility or an accountability does the state of Texas has with all of this teacher shortage mess?
Well, I think it's at all levels. Obviously, the state, because the state controls so many decisions around education today, not only the finance, but just decisions in general,
right,
has to bear some responsibility there, correct? But I also think there's local practices that are occurring that are not making teaching the profession, the attractive profession I think it should be. I love teaching. I love teaching now at the higher ed level. I mean, I just love that experience, and there's nothing that replaces it. I have a student that I was his tennis coach years ago, and we still stay in contact today. Mm-hmm. I see many of my students that I've had throughout my career or their parents on a regular basis. It's such a rewarding profession. But I think so many things has happened to the profession over the last 10 years. And I think part of that is we've taken so much decision-making away from teachers, and I think we need to return that. And I think you see that not only in state policy, but you see it in local policy too. There's been this trend in education to keep taking to different areas of responsibility to kind of take over the decision making. So, the local district maybe doesn't put the faith in the campus the way it should, and so takes more control from the campus to the central office.
Okay. The
state then takes more control from the districts to the state. Like we keep taking decision making away from the entity. And I've always had this belief that the best decisions are made closest to the action. I couldn't sit in my office in Spring Branch and make a decision that worked well probably at 46 different sites in that district. Mm-hmm. So I felt like I need to put my faith in the school leaders and the school campus to make those decisions, in the school community to make those decisions. But what we're seeing is this trend of constantly centralizing decisions, and even more so at the state level now. You look at the curriculum decisions, you look at the finance decisions, text, everything, just a very centralizing of decisions and control, and taking away from the entity that's closest to the student, which is the teacher and the school leader.
Why is that? Why is that the case? Why have administrators moved away from trusting teachers for making those decisions for their students?
Well, I think intense accountability and high-stakes testing has definitely influenced that, right? There's not the level of risk-taking we need in education today because everyone's fearful of doing that. Because at the end of the day, people are so focused on their school rating, their school district rating.
Sure.
And what we've done is we've taken something that's very important, which is testing and seeing how students are doing, and we've made it such high stakes that becomes the focus today. And then that starts to influence decisions that we make within our system. I hear conversations among school leaders and school district leaders about, boy, I really would like to give our schools more autonomy, but boy, if I do that, what happens if they don't perform where they need to? There's this belief that we can, if we centralize things, we can control for performance. What I think we do is we create a box of performance, and in that we create this box so people don't fall out of the box at the bottom of the box and perform poorly, but we also kill the ability for people to outperform at the top end of the spectrum. And I think that's a trend that we have seen over the last 10 or 15 years, and I see that trend even in the classroom, just less ability for the classroom teachers or set of classroom teachers to really solve the problems of teaching and learning. And I'm just a believer that the problems are best solved closest to the action.
And it sounds like there's also exams happening on the new teacher front. It looks like Texas will be adopting this new educative teacher performance assessment exam. Is this a step in the right direction? Let me give you some numbers here. 6 years ago in Washington State, a study was done there that showed Hispanic teacher candidates were more than 3 times likely to fail this exam when compared with their white candidates. Washington State scrapped this exam last year, and Washington is now ranked, the top state for teachers this year. In New York State, black candidates who took the test were nearly twice as likely to fail compared with their white peers. New York also scrapped this exam recently, saying, according to the Texas Tribune, candidates were mostly trying to finish the exam requirements rather than learn from those student teaching activities. New York is now ranked number 2 as far as the best state for teachers. So something tells me that this new exam is not the best solution for the state of Texas.
Depends on the quality of the exam, but I think there is, again, a trend, and we see this with student exams too, right?
Yeah.
Exams should be really just gauging how well are individuals meeting the expectations that they need for either graduating high school or being prepared to be a teacher. I think there's this trend to continue to make exams harder and harder. And by the way, when people say they're going to make them harder, they tend to make them trickier. And they tend not to make them a direct reflection of, am I gauging the skill set I'm trying to gauge? And we've seen clearly over history that exams are skewed in how they treat different individuals within our society and the performance of those. So is it important to gauge, has a student at the university level learn the skill set to be successful in the classroom? I think there's a valid piece around that. I teach individuals who are preparing to be principals and superintendents, and they have to take an exam also to receive that credential. I think there's a valid piece there. But the question is the exam the correct exam? And is it there to gauge what it should do? And that's just gauge the proficiency and the skill set that you want. We also know that there's a whole set of skill sets that you're never going to be able to engage in an exam. And that's why I think it's so important that you balance the experience of working with individuals who are becoming teachers, principals, superintendents, and balancing that with just a score that occurs.
I agree.
On exam, and really getting to know the person and the experience that person has.
What happened to you that really sort of pushed you to go into the college sector? I mean, look, you've done this much work over at Spring Branch ISD, and then now you're, as a professor at the University of Houston. Something had to have happened in your life that said, you know what, I want to go into the college sector now. Go that route. What led you to make that decision?
Well, I think it goes back to my original decision to go into teaching. So I actually have a business degree from the University of Texas. I have a business degree with a double major in international business and finance. Mm-hmm. Worked in the corporate setting for a while. Grew up in small towns with my dad running small businesses. The corporate sector and small businesses are run very differently. But I was very fortunate in the corporate sector I was in, where our vice president was very involved in junior achievement. And so we were able to volunteer a lot. And I had, throughout growing up, worked with youth, in high school or in college, loved working with youth. And I realized that I like that more, that experience of volunteering in a school at the time versus what I was experiencing in the corporate world, and said to myself, you know what, I at the time I wasn't dating anyone. My wife and I had not met yet. And I said, if I don't go back now and get my credentials to be a teacher, I'm going to get locked into a salary and I won't do it. So I went back, and it was the best decision I ever made. Loved the experience, and knew, though, having that business background experience, wanted to lead something one day. So then went ahead and received my master's, my doctorate, led a school, and then led a school system. So I think when I retired, knowing I missed the classroom, because obviously the way things are structured today, you need to leave the classroom to go into those leadership roles in leading a school as a school principal or as a superintendent. But I knew I always wanted to be back in the classroom, and the university provided that opportunity. And I love working with individuals who are preparing to be principals and are preparing to be superintendents. I think it's such an important role. The most important role we know is the teaching role, right? Just having great teachers. But that experience of working with students and that motivating factor of working with individuals just really led me back into the classroom and led me into the classroom in higher education.
We're speaking in studio with Dr. Duncan Klusman. He's been a professor at the University of Houston for 4 years. He became superintendent of schools at Spring Branch ISD from 2004 to 2015. Dr. Klusman has been working in public education since 1988. I mentioned the TikTok prank earlier with students calling teachers by their first name. There seems to be a fundamental disrespect, for teachers. They're expected to do more with less. They're penalized for leaving the profession. If they leave by, getting their license or certification, they could get it suspended or revoked during, the school year if they do that. They're making less than they were over a decade ago. Many run the risk of losing their pension. How did we get here? How did we really get to this point?
Well, I think when we don't prioritize individuals over time, then individual decisions over a decade or more can then end up in the result of where we are today. I'll give you one example. I think the pension side, right? Mm-hmm. Part of the whole aspect of a pension around governmental work is that individuals in those roles are going to accept a salary a lot less than they would in the private sector to do the same type of role. And if they're going to do that over 25, 30 years, then they're going to be rewarded through that process at the end to have a stable income over time through a pension. But we've seen a constant attack on pensions, right? And just a rolling back of pensions in our society because we don't want to fund them at the level that we need to fund them. So, I see this happen across governmental work in general, right? The post office. My father-in-law, who passed away a couple of years ago, retired after 30-something years in the post office. It provided him, a good, stable living for many years of his life. He lived a great life in retirement because he had that foundation. And so I think when we see these things constantly erode, but I think they are individual decisions made over time that doesn't prioritize the profession. And then we end up in this situation. I would say this, though, most of the research shows that teachers mainly leave the profession because they feel like they're not vested in, or the working environment that they're in is not the right working environment. So when we see things like compensation salaries, they're usually around number 3 or 4 on most surveys or most research around why do people leave the profession. You usually see things more about, does the system invest in me as a professional? Do they give me great opportunities for professional learning? Or what type of climate am I working in? Again, as I've said before, when we take the decision-making around from teachers, I think it makes it less interesting, less motivating to be a teacher. So I think there's so many of these factors that we have to consider. And I think to value the profession, we have to look at all of those areas. Salary is very important. Pensions are very important. But working environment and just the respect to the profession, I think, is really important.
Coming up, our conversation concludes with UH professor Dr. Duncan Klusman. We'll talk solutions. What will finally get teachers back into the classroom? And we'll also discuss the long-term effect of the pandemic and its impact on education. Plus, we'll meet Terry Batiste, a former teacher and now a staff member at Houston Public Media. She'll share with us her own story and the lessons she's learned since leaving the classroom. I'm Eddie Robinson. I see you. Our final segment happens in just a minute. If you're enjoying this program, please be sure to subscribe to our podcast, I See You with Eddie Robinson. You can hear all the past episodes and be notified when new episodes are released. Also, please take a minute to give us a review or comment. We love getting feedback from our listeners.
Today's episode deals with challenges in the education system. This episode was recorded before this week's tragic events in Uvalde, Texas.
This is ICU. I'm Eddie Robinson, and we've been speaking with former Spring Branch ISD Superintendent of Schools and UH professor, Dr. Duncan Klusman. He's providing us with a great deal of insight and perspective on why more and more teachers are looking at that exit sign that's shining right outside their classroom door. Dr. Klusman believes that salary might not be the number one reason why teachers are leaving. It's not at the top of the list of reasons. But Dr. Klusman, I still can't take my eye off this map of the United States that's sent to us from Scholaroo, a group that produces data reports on education. And this map of the 50 states ranks teacher salary and compensation. Texas is 43, Mississippi is 46, Florida is 45, Louisiana is 49. I still have to come back to the salaries, especially when you think of low-income communities and those students who are in those areas where teachers really, really need to be paid, and they need to be paid accordingly. There's something going on in the South that's not going on in Illinois or Washington State or New York or Massachusetts or Connecticut. There's something else at stake. What steps can be taken to address teacher salaries, especially rural or low-income areas of the South? What can be done to incentivize new teachers to work in those areas?
Well, I definitely think you make a valid point there around the whole salaries in the South, because the map is very clear, right, in that whole piece of it. But again, people really do want to make sure that not only salaries need to be in place where they need to be. And again, I think the salary issue is driven by not taking care of teachers who stay in the profession more than 10, 15 years. Because again, that analysis is based off of average salary, which I think is being driven by we're not rewarding the people who'd say they're going to make this as a career, right? We're not putting that in place over time. We're also seeing many more policies, I think, in those southern states where we've taken the decision-making away from the teachers and we've taken it to a centralized level at the state level. So I think you're seeing that effect too throughout the country, but mainly I think you can see that in all of those southern states where more and more decision-making has been taken away from the classroom teacher. I will say this, because you make a very good point, Eddie, about low-income communities.
Yeah.
I'm really worried about the pandemic because the research was already very clear in this for decades, right? That our least experienced teachers are in our lowest income communities. And so I think the pandemic could actually make that much worse. And so I think we do need to look at differentiated pay and making sure that we're rewarding individuals who go into schools that really need the most improvement and provide those resources. But again, at the end of the day, I think for those schools to improve at the greatest rate, you have to put your trust in the people who are closest to the student, and that's in the teacher.
We'll get back to more of our conversation with UH professor Dr. Klusman in just a moment, but we also wanted to reach out to a Houston Public Media staff member who's also a former teacher. ICU spoke to Terry Batiste about her experience as a teacher with HISD and why she decided to leave the classroom.
The drain of teaching was a bit much. There was no work-life balance with my own family. They liked that I was teaching, but they hated that I was teaching at the same time because I essentially had no time for them. When I would leave the school, which was late almost every day, like getting home 6, 7 o'clock in the evening, I would immediately go right to planning for the next day because I had to change things up. Maybe something didn't work out, or maybe I need to reinforce another lesson. And then on weekends, it was always planning as well. So honestly, my family really didn't get mommy or wife until if it was a 3-day weekend, maybe they got me for a day. If it was the holiday break, there was a week where I relaxed, and then that second week, I'm preparing, trying to get ahead. During the summer, I was literally like a grizzly bear. I just slept and ate for at least a good 3 to 4 weeks because I was so exhausted.
And I'm sure many teachers in Texas and others across the country would agree with her about exhaustion. I'm Eddie Robinson, and you're listening to ICU. We've been chatting extensively with Dr. Duncan Klusman, a University of Houston professor who's worked in public education for decades. We continue our conversation and explore the certification process for new teachers.
These alternative certifications, what's going on here? Help our listeners understand what alternative certifications are, and explain to our listeners how come over half of teachers hired end up having earned these alternative certifications. What challenges come with that factor?
Yeah, in the state of Texas now, it may even be more of a percentage, but at least half of the teachers that are hired in the state of Texas each year come through alternative certification, which means they already have a bachelor's degree in a field, and in the field, maybe in the field that they're going to then teach in. And then they're going to, instead of go through a formalized educator prep program at a university, they're going to go into an alternative program where they're going to be provided some level of coursework about how to teach, how to plan to teach, student discipline, classroom management. But then they're going to go right into the classroom. Once they pass the exam, they have their bachelor's degree, they pass the exam, and they have a basic level of kind of professional development. Then they're going to go right into a classroom, and they're going to be observed over the year. And if they are successful, then they will get their certification after that 1 year in the classroom. But many of these programs have gone online, and they went online before the pandemic. So this wasn't a move to the pandemic.
Okay.
And I think the quality of those programs come into question.
There you go.
I know in my last probably 5 years, we clearly saw programs that we were concerned about. It'd be no different than you receiving someone applying from a university that you may be concerned about their quality of instruction. We definitely saw that occurring within programs. And I think recently there's a significant report of the largest program in the state of Texas having issues around the quality of their program. So I would tell you, I experienced great teachers coming out of alternative certification, but also there are clearly programs that are really struggling. And I think that's an area that we need to focus on. My belief is, having come through a formalized method,
Okay.
that very formalized method is a really important piece. But however, that's changed over the last 20 years too, where particularly in secondary schools, students do less of the educator prep side and more in locking in the bachelor's degree in their content area, and then doing the educator prep, and not as much of a focus as we probably need on the educator prep. Decades ago, Sam Houston State, what's now Texas State, which is Southwest Texas, were teachers' colleges, right? We realized the need to develop, I would say this is in probably the 20s, 30s, to develop this teaching core. And we created these teacher colleges to produce large numbers of teachers. Coming out of World War II, all of a sudden you see an explosion in public schools and in universities, and you had the GI Bill. And so we really had institutions that their focus was to develop great teachers and large numbers of them. I think we have to get back to a focus like that, right? It can't be just a side piece. It has to be a focus of, let's develop individuals who have degrees in teaching, who are focused completely in teaching, who it's woven through their whole experience of their 4-year bachelor's experience, not, I need to take these 3 or 4 courses so I can be certified. We have to get back to a focus of preparing individuals at the level we need to prepare them at.
Why do you think teachers who've left are transitioning into instructor roles that coach current teachers?
Well, this is a trend I'm really concerned about. I mean, we use this in my day of being a leader of a system, but I always try to look at it in terms of its effectiveness. But I think we're seeing it, and I think with the federal funds, you're seeing like a really increase in these types of roles, where we take our best teachers out of the classroom and we move them into roles to kind of coach teachers in the classroom. Now, again, I think this is this trend of where we think we need to have more and more people in a teacher's classroom telling them what to do. And by the way, I hear experiences there that I just would not be acceptable to me today, where I hear like some coaches go in, instructional coaches go in, and they'll correct the teacher right in front of the students. In many cases, it's done very appropriately. But I think, again, this goes back to my earlier comments. We're taking more and more of the decision way. We think, teachers don't know how to teach. They need more of this, right? We think then principals don't know how to lead. They need more central office to tell them what to do. And then the state thinks that school districts don't know what to do, so we need the state to tell the school districts what to do. Bottom line is, if people aren't in the right mental state, they can't learn at the levels they need to. They can't teach at the levels they need to. And I am fearful that we're not taking into consideration taking care of the personal needs of students, teachers, and of families, to be honest with you.
Here's former teacher Terry Batiste.
It was a strong administration there, but I kind of felt like there was a member of administration that had it out for me at that time, because not only was that individual my appraiser, they also volunteered to be my mentor, and they would always just burst in my classroom and accuse me of doing things that wasn't true and call me literally like a liar without saying it. And my students were looking at me like, okay, Ms. Batiste, you're always telling us about, your character and be true about your word. And when that administrator realized the mistakes that had been made, they would always pull me to the side to apologize in private. And it was always like this berating thing until they got this emotional response out of me.
That was Houston Public Media's Terry Batiste, a former teacher with HISD.
We need to return the decision-making to the folks closest to the action. We need to put trust in them. And I think that's just really important. And so this is a trend that I'm actually very concerned about, where we tend to take great teachers out of the classroom. They're not in an instructor role anymore of teaching students directly. They're helping teachers because for some reason we believe teachers don't know how to do their role that I think they do know how to do if they're given the right environment to do it in.
We've talked about a lot here, and even you've had some great solutions and some great points here. Is there anything else in terms of obvious solutions in your mind that we haven't talked about that can actually take place to improve or enhance or help get our extraordinary teachers back into the classroom?
it has to be a comprehensive approach, right? It can't be a one-off approach. It can't be let's every 2 years decide we're going to talk big about doing teacher pay raises. We need to look at it over a long period of time. We need to make sure we're very strategic about it. And then we need to look at how we're making decisions and put that trust back into the teacher's hand, into the school leader's hand. The rubber meets the road at the campus level, in the classroom and at the campus leadership. We need great leaders, right, who get along with people and can see and understand systems and create this great work environment for teachers to maximize their skill set. Remember, teaching is an art and a science. I think for the last 15, 20 years, we focused completely on the science and not on the art of it. And we've got to get back to focusing on both the art of teaching and the science of teaching. And if we do that well, we'll create environments where students excel, where teachers feel great about the environment they're in. And then again, if we look at how we compensate teachers throughout their whole career, then we'll keep people in the profession and we'll have what we really want to have happen in public education.
Throughout your career as an educator and the plans that you've got mapped out for your future, please tell us what have been the biggest life lessons you've learned about yourself thus far.
Well, I think just, I grew up around a family who said you treat people well, but I think also getting to know people and understanding their story is so much the life lesson, because we see the world through our own lens, and our lenses are different. Your lens is totally different than my lens. And if I don't just spend time getting to know you and listen to your stories, I don't understand your lens. And just having the acknowledgement that the lenses are different, the framing of views are different. So we can be talking about one topic or word and have a total different approach to it. One of the words I see this happen all the time and has happened right here in the Third Ward, right? Gentrification. One person will see it as a positive term, and another person will see it as a negative term, the same term. So I think just really what I have learned is if I treat people with respect, if I get to know them well and learn their story, I just become such a better individual. I think that's been one of the life lessons I've learned throughout my lifetime.
He's Dr. Duncan Klusman, a professor at the University of Houston, and he's been working in public education since 1988. Thank you so much, Professor, for being a guest on ICU in studio.
Thanks, A. Thanks for having me here.
Our team includes technical director Todd Holzlander, producer Laura Burks, editors Mark DeClaudio and John Mitchell Good, sound designer Dave McDermott. ICU is a production of Houston Public Media. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter. And for more updates and episodes, visit our website, iseeushow.org. I'm your host and executive producer, Eddie Robinson. Thanks so much for listening. And remember, I feel you, we hear you, I see you. Until next time.